Chapter 1. The Fete at Fernown Green. The summer fete at Fernown Green had always been, in the collective memory of the village, the sort of occasion at which nothing could possibly go wrong. There was the white marquee with its uneven poles, put up every year by the same 3 men from the parish council, who argued every year about how to do it, and every year produced the same slightly lopsided result. There were the trestle tables covered in Union Jack bunting, and the vicar's wife presiding over a pyramid of Victoria sponges with the proprietary air of a general reviewing troops. There were children threading through adult knees, and dogs straining at leads, and a brass band from the neighbouring village of Weston Carrow, playing something that had been written as a march, but had softened, over the years of amateur interpretation, into something more like a suggestion. Miss Marple had been given the chair with the cushion. This was always arranged in advance by Mrs. Hargreave, the vicar's wife, who considered it an act of charity, and could not be persuaded that Miss Marple found charity rather more comfortable to dispense than to receive. Nevertheless, the chair was pleasant, positioned just beside the refreshments table, in a spot of shade that moved with the afternoon, and Miss Marple had accepted it with the gracious composure of someone who has long since learned to choose her battles. She sat with her knitting, a pale blue thing of uncertain ambition, and watched. There was a great deal to watch. The summer fete drew people who did not ordinarily mix, which was always useful. It drew Colonel Branscom and his daughter Iris, who had driven from Carston Hall, and who were acknowledged, by general consensus, to be rather grander than Fernown Green deserved. The Colonel was the sort of man who stood with his hands clasped behind his back regardless of circumstance, as though preparing always to receive bad news with fortitude. His daughter Iris was handsome rather than pretty, a distinction Miss Marple found much more interesting, with a quality of suppressed restlessness that expressed itself in the way her eyes moved across a crowd, looking for something that was never quite there. Mrs. Celia Dunbar was there naturally. Mrs. Dunbar was always at everything, a stout and well-intentioned woman of 55, who served on every committee the village possessed, and whose contributions to meetings were lengthy, were earnest, and largely unnecessary. She was talking now to young Dr. Philip Vane, the new GP, who had arrived in Fernown Green 18 months ago, and who had the misfortune of being both eligible and pleasant-looking, which meant he was forever being talked at by people who had daughters, nieces, or opinions about his professional hours. Miss Marple had formed a view of Dr. Vane early on. She had not yet shared it with anyone. The person she had watched most carefully that afternoon, however, was none of these. He was a man she did not know. He stood somewhat apart from the main bustle of the fete, near the hedgerow that divided the green from the old churchyard path. He was perhaps 45, lean in the way of someone who had once been heavier, and had reduced through some mechanism other than health, worry, perhaps, or hardship, but he wore a light grey jacket that was slightly too warm for the day, and he held a paper cup of lemonade that he never drank, turning it slowly in both hands with the unconscious care of someone whose thoughts were entirely elsewhere. He was watching the fete with an expression Miss Marple had learned, over many years and many peculiar situations, to take seriously. He was not here to enjoy himself. He was here to find someone. She had first noticed him at 2:30, when the brass band had begun its second set, and most people's attention had shifted towards the raffle. He had walked slowly around the perimeter of the green, as though taking the measure of the space, pausing once near the church gate and once near the long table where Mrs. Hargreaves' sponges were disappearing at a satisfying rate. Both times, his gaze had swept the crowd with a systematic patience that was not the aimless wandering of a man simply taking in the scene. He had not been looking at the stalls. He had been looking at people. More precisely. And this was the detail that had caused Miss Marple to set down her knitting for a full moment and think he had been looking with increasing focus in her direction. Not at her, she had initially thought. Past her, through her. At the refreshments table, perhaps. Or at Mrs. Celia Dunbar, holding court 2 chairs to the left. But then Mrs. Dunbar had moved off toward the tombola, and the unknown man's gaze had not followed her. It had remained fixed on the chair with the cushion, on Miss Marple. She had resumed her knitting. She was not, by temperament or experience, a woman given to alarm, and she had sat in many rooms, with many people whose intentions she had not trusted, and she had found, on the whole, that stillness and attention were rather more useful than agitation. One saw more clearly, when one was not moving, what she saw now. Watching the man from beneath the brim of her hat was someone managing a very specific kind of tension. The tension of someone waiting to act, and waiting only because the moment had not yet arrived. The brass band struck up something approximating Jerusalem. A child knocked over a pot of jam. Miss Marple counted her stitches. The unknown man turned away from her at last and walked unhurriedly toward the far end of the green, where he disappeared through the break in the hedgerow that led to the churchyard path. 3 minutes later, from somewhere beyond that hedgerow, came a sound that was not the brass band. It was a short, flat, decisive crack. Several people looked up. The band wavered and stopped. Colonel Branscom said, very quietly, "Good God!" and Miss Marple set down her knitting, folded it neatly, and stood. Chapter 2. What the Village Knew by Tea-time. The body was found by Mr. Alec Tumby, the sexton, who had been cutting back the ivy on the east wall of St. Cuthbert's when the sound reached him. He was a phlegmatic man by nature. Decades of proximity to headstones had given him a settled relationship with mortality. But even he had gone quite pale by the time he appeared at the gap in the hedgerow, and told Colonel Branscom that there was a man down on the churchyard path, and that the man was not moving, and that in his considered opinion the man was not going to. In the fete dissolved in the particular way that English public events dissolve when confronted with the genuinely unexpected. Not with screaming or stampede, but with a kind of collective, murmuring uncertainty. People turning to one another with half-finished sentences. The children being drawn instinctively to their parents' sides. The brass band packing away their instruments with solemn efficiency, as though music itself had become inappropriate. Constable Hedges arrived within 12 minutes on his bicycle, followed 40 minutes later by Detective Inspector Ravel from Carston, who drove a dark green Humber and had the careful manner of a man who had learned to be thorough because he had once been hasty and regretted it. The dead man was identified by the contents of his wallet as Mr. Leonard Doyle. He was 47 years old, originally of Bristol, latterly of no fixed address that the initial search could determine. There was a driving licence, £7 and change, a folded piece of paper with an address on it that Inspector Ravel pocketed without sharing, and a photograph, small, slightly worn at the edges, of a woman and a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, standing in front of what appeared to be a seaside railing somewhere grey and northern. He had been shot once. The weapon had not been recovered. By 5 o'clock, the village of Fernown Green knew all of this and a great deal more, besides most of the additional information being entirely fabricated. Mrs. Celia Dunbar held the first of what would become several informal councils of war in her sitting room on Marsh Lane, a fortified by Darjeeling, and a residual excitement that she was doing her sincere best to conceal behind an expression of grave concern. "He was watching the children," she told Mrs. Pooles and old Mr. Finch, with the authority of someone reporting a first-hand observation. "I noticed it particularly, standing there by the hedge, eyes going everywhere. I said to myself, 'Celia, that is not a man here for the tombola.'" "Did you speak to him?" asked Mrs. Pooles. "One doesn't like to, not with a man of that type." "What type was he?" said Mr. Finch, who was 81, and had found that asking the obvious question was more efficient than waiting for people to reach it. Mrs. Dunbar paused. "Unsettled," she said finally. "That's the word." And there was something unsettled about him. At the Carston Arms, Fernown Green being too small for its own public house, several of the younger men who had been working the fete stalls had gathered by 5:30, and the version of events that circulated there was considerably more dramatic. The prevailing theory, advanced by Terry Marsh, who worked the hook-a-duck, was that Leonard Doyle had been a gangster from Bristol who had made enemies and followed them to Fernown Green, only to find that his enemies had followed him back. This version had the advantage of explaining everything while accounting for nothing in particular, and it was received with the enthusiasm that attaches to any story both exciting and unfalsifiable. "But who shot him?" said someone. "One of the others," said Terry Marsh, with confident vagueness. "Or what others?" "The ones who followed him. I didn't see any others." "That's the point, isn't it?" said Terry Marsh, with the satisfied air of a man who has just won an argument. "You wouldn't?" Colonel Branscom returned to Carston Hall with his daughter Iris and said nothing of consequence until dinner, at which point he observed that the whole business was deeply unfortunate, and that the police seemed competent enough, and that he hoped it would not colour people's memory of what had otherwise been a perfectly good fete. Iris said nothing at all. She ate her soup with the careful attention of someone grateful to have something to look at. Dr. Philip Vane stopped briefly at Miss Marple's cottage on his way home, which surprised her, though she gave no sign of it. "I wanted to make sure you were quite all right," he said, standing in her small hallway with his hat in his hands, looking rather younger than he did in his surgery. "It must have been a shock." "Very kind of you," said Miss Marple. "I'm perfectly well, thank you. Do sit down." He sat. He did not quite relax. "Did you know him?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly. "The dead man?" A pause, brief, perhaps not meaningful. "No," said Dr. Vane. "Should I have done?" "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "I only wondered, as you seem rather shaken. And you did not know the poor man as far as you are aware. And it strikes me that young men in your profession are generally better insulated against sudden death than the rest of us. More tea?" He accepted the tea. He stayed another 20 minutes. He talked about the fete, about Constable Hedges, about the extraordinary efficiency of the brass band in packing up. He talked, Miss Marple noted, about everything except Leonard Doyle. When he left, she stood at the window and watched him walk up the lane in the long evening light, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders carrying something that had not been there that morning. Then she went to her writing desk and took out a small notebook and wrote, in her careful hand, a single question. Why did Leonard Doyle have this address? She underlined it once and closed the notebook and went to put the kettle on. Chapter 3. The art of saying nothing. The inquest was held on Thursday morning in the function room of the Carston Town Hall, which smelled of floor polish and old decisions. Inspector Ravel sat to one side with a constable and a notebook, watching the room, with the patient attention of a man collecting data he would sort later. The coroner, Dr. Sutcliffe, who had the dry efficiency of someone who considered emotion an indulgence in professional settings, moved through the proceedings at a pace that discouraged lingering. Miss Marple had come by the 9 o'clock bus. She sat near the back, which was where she preferred to sit at any gathering where observation mattered more than being observed. The formal findings were brief and unsurprising. Leonard Doyle, 47, had died of a single gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range between the hours of 2:30 and 3 in the afternoon of Saturday the 12th. The weapon remained unrecovered. There were no witnesses to the act itself. Death had been rapid, and the coroner returned a verdict of unlawful killing and released the matter to the police with the brisk satisfaction of someone handing over a parcel that was not, strictly speaking, his problem. What interested Miss Marple was not the formal proceedings. It was the room. Fernown Green had turned out in considerable numbers, as English villages always do when the alternative is remaining at home, and merely imagining what is being said. Mrs. Dunbar was present naturally, and had arranged herself in the third row with the proprietary confidence of someone who considered herself a principal. She wore her best hat and a look of solemn importance that she had clearly been practicing. Colonel Branscom sat near the front, upright, expression carefully neutral. Beside him, the iris stared at the middle distance with a stillness that was different in quality from her father's. His stillness was composed. Hers was effortful. Dr. Vane arrived 3 minutes after the proceedings began, slipping into a chair near the side wall. He had not, Miss Marple thought, slept particularly well. Two people Miss Marple did not recognize sat together near the window. A woman of perhaps 50, sharp-featured and dry-eyed, and a younger man beside her who had the look of a solicitor. Careful suit, careful expression, nothing given away for free. She filed them away and continued watching. After the formal proceedings closed, the room rearranged itself in the manner of rooms after events, people drifting into clusters of 3 and 4, voices dropping to a register that felt both hushed and urgent. It was, Miss Marple reflected, essentially the same atmosphere as a tea party after an announcement, that particular English combination of excitement and the performance of not being excited. She made her way without haste toward the side of the room where a table of rather poor coffee had been provided. "Terrible business," said Mrs. Dunbar, appearing beside her with the unerring instinct of a woman who considered herself indispensable to other people's conversations. "Simply terrible. I said to Mr. Dunbar this morning, one doesn't feel safe." "I'm sure Mr. Dunbar was very reassuring," said Miss Marple. "He said to lock the doors." Mrs. Dunbar looked briefly disappointed by this memory. "As though one doesn't already." "Did you ever see the man before?" Miss Marple asked. "Before Saturday, I mean." "Never in my life, Mrs. Dunbar lowered her voice with the relish of someone who has been waiting to lower it. "Though I will say, and I've said it to Mrs. Poole's, that the address they found in his pocket was Carston Road, which is barely 3 miles from here." "Which means he had connections in the area, Jane. Connections he hadn't declared." "One rarely declares one's connections in advance of being shot," said Miss Marple mildly. Mrs. Dunbar blinked. "No, I suppose not." Miss Marple carried her coffee, undrinkable, as she had expected, toward the window, and from that position she watched Dr. Vane. He had not joined any of the natural clusters. He stood against the wall with his cup, occasionally nodding when someone passed and caught his eye, but initiating nothing and inviting nothing. This was, in itself, unremarkable. Some people were simply private, but Miss Marple had observed Philip Vane at the village surgery open day, at the harvest supper, at the fete before Leonard Doyle had fallen, and he was not ordinarily a man who stood at walls. He was easy in company. He listened well. People liked him, and he permitted them to. Today he was somewhere else entirely behind his own eyes. Once, and only once, his gaze moved to the two strangers by the window, the sharp-featured woman and the careful young solicitor. The look lasted barely 2 seconds. Then he moved his eyes away with the deliberate care of someone who has decided not to look at a thing. Miss Marple set down her undrinkable coffee. She managed, through the gentle navigation of a woman who has spent decades moving through rooms without appearing to go anywhere in particular, to find herself standing near the two strangers as they prepared to leave. "Forgive me," she said in the sweet, slightly vague tone she had found so useful over the years. "I don't believe we've met. Are you from Fernown Green?" The woman looked at her with clear, measuring eyes. "No, we're from Bristol." A pause, brief and weighted. "Leonard Doyle was my brother." "I'm very sorry," said Miss Marple, with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "A terrible shock. Were you close?" The woman's expression shifted, fractionally. Not grief, not quite. Something more complicated than grief, in the way that feelings about difficult people are always more complicated than simple grief. "We had not spoken," she said carefully, "in some years." The young solicitor touched her elbow. She allowed herself to be drawn away. Miss Marple watched them go, as she thought about the photograph in Leonard Doyle's wallet. The woman and the young girl, the grey northern sea. She thought about the careful way his sister had said some years, neither softening it nor explaining it. She thought about the particular quality of Dr. Vane's 2-second glance, the way it had moved away so deliberately. The room was emptying. Inspector Ravel was speaking to Constable Hedges near the door. Miss Marple put on her gloves, button by careful button, and considered the fact that in every room today, the most informative moment had been a silence. There had been rather a lot of them, and they had not all belonged to the same person. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Comfortable Theory. Inspector Ravel came to Miss Marple's cottage on Friday afternoon, which she had expected, and what she had not expected was that he would come alone, without Constable Hedges, and that he would accept her offer of tea with the grateful sincerity of a man who had not sat down since morning. He was, she had decided at the inquest, a fundamentally decent person, which was both his strength and, in the present circumstances, his limitation. Decent people tended towards the most decent available explanation, and the most decent available explanation was not always the correct one. "I wanted to ask you about Saturday," he said, settling into the chair opposite her, with his notebook open on his knee. "You were seated near the hedgerow for most of the afternoon, I understand." "The chair with the cushion," Miss Marple confirmed. "Mrs. Hargreave is very thoughtful." "Did you observe Mr. Doyle at any point before the incident?" "I did," said Miss Marple. "He arrived at approximately 2:15 and spent some time walking the perimeter of the green. He did not speak to anyone that I observed. He held a paper cup of lemonade, but did not drink from it. He left through the hedgerow gap at approximately 2:50, and I heard the shot perhaps 3 minutes later. Inspector Ravel was writing, "You're very precise." I had very little else to occupy me. The knitting was going poorly. He smiled briefly. "Did he approach you, or make any gesture in your direction?" Miss Marple considered the ethics of precision. "He looked in my direction on several occasions," she said. "Whether he was looking at me specifically, I couldn't say with certainty." This was true. She chose not to add what she privately believed. Right. Ravel closed his notebook partially, the gesture of a man moving from official inquiry to informal conversation. "I'll tell you where we are, Miss Marple, because frankly, you'll hear most of it from Mrs. Dunbar within the week regardless." "That is very probable," she agreed. "Leonard Doyle has a record. Minor, mostly, receiving stolen goods, one charge of fraud that was reduced on appeal. Bristol connections, as Mrs. Dunbar appears to have already broadcast. The address in his pocket was a property on Carston Road, a rented cottage, been empty 6 months, owned by a man called Geoffrey Aldis, who lives in Portugal and manages it through an agent. Dead end there." "And his reason for being at the fete?" "That," said Ravel, "is where it becomes interesting." He accepted a second biscuit with the automatic gratitude of a tired man. "We've found a connection between Doyle and a man called Sherwood. Marcus Sherwood, also Bristol. Similar background, similar record, considerably less minor. Sherwood has been in the area. Stayed 2 nights at the Carston Arms under a false name. We've confirmed it from the register and a description from the landlord." "And you believe Mr. Sherwood shot Mr. Doyle?" "I believe it's the most coherent explanation available. Doyle came here for reasons we haven't fully established. Possibly to meet someone. Possibly to retrieve something. Sherwood followed him, or preceded him. And the meeting in the churchyard path was not a friendly one." Ravel spread his hands in the manner of a man presenting something neat. "It has the shape of a settling of accounts." Miss Marple looked at her knitting. "It does have that shape," she said pleasantly. "You sound unconvinced." "I'm old and cautious," she said. "I find shapes sometimes deceive." Ravel studied her for a moment. He was, she thought, rather more perceptive than he allowed himself to appear. "Is there something specific that troubles you?" "Several small things," said Miss Marple. "But I wouldn't like to waste your time with the speculations of an old woman when you have a perfectly serviceable theory already in hand." He left 20 minutes later, having consumed 4 biscuits and provided, she reflected, considerably more information than he had gathered. She did not think he would resent this when he eventually noticed it, and the something specific that troubled Miss Marple was this. A man settling accounts does not spend 30 minutes walking calmly around a village fete in full view of 60 people before committing the act. That was not how settlements of that kind were conducted. Such men, and Miss Marple had encountered enough of them at one remove or another to have formed reliable views, chose their moment with the economy of purpose. They did not linger. They did not hold undrunk lemonade. They did not stand at the perimeter looking at old women in cushioned chairs. Leonard Doyle had come to the fete looking for something specific, or someone specific, and Marcus Sherwood, if Sherwood had indeed fired the shot, had been waiting in the churchyard, and which meant Sherwood had known Doyle would come through that particular gap in the hedgerow at that particular time, which meant either Sherwood had been watching from the churchyard long enough to anticipate it. Or someone had told him. She was considering this on Saturday morning, deadheading the roses along her front path, when Iris Branscom came around the corner of the lane and stopped with the startled expression of someone who had hoped not to encounter anyone. "Miss Marple," she recovered quickly. "Good morning. Good morning, my dear. Were you walking?" Yes, walking." Iris looked at the roses as though they required careful examination. She was dressed for town rather than walking. Good shoes, a cream blouse that would show the dust of the lane, and there was a tension about her jaw that the morning light did not flatter. "Will you come in for coffee?" said Miss Marple. "I have a rather nice Kenyan blend that a nephew sent." Iris hesitated. The hesitation lasted precisely long enough to tell Miss Marple that she had somewhere else to be, and had not quite decided whether to go there. "Just for a moment," she said. They went inside. Miss Marple put the coffee on and set out 2 cups and said nothing at all, which was a technique she had refined to considerable effect over many years. Silence, offered without expectation, had a way of filling itself. Iris sat at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. "Did you know him?" she said at last. "Doyle." "I did not," said Miss Marple. "Did you?" A pause. Outside, a wood pigeon made its repetitive inquiry of the morning. "No," said Iris Branscom. "Of course not." It was the "of course" that interested Miss Marple most. That small, unnecessary reinforcement. Added not for her benefit, she thought, but for Iris's own. She poured the coffee and said nothing, and waited to see what the silence would produce next. Chapter 5. The cup that was not where it should have been. Iris Branscom drank her coffee in the careful way of someone who needed something to do with her hands. She talked about the village, about the fete, about how dreadful the whole business was for Fernown Green's reputation, and Miss Marple listened to all of it with every appearance of agreement, and noted, beneath the surface of the conversation, the things that were not being said. Iris did not mention her father. She did not mention Dr. Vane. She did not, after her single question about Leonard Doyle, mention him again. She talked as people talk when they are talking to avoid talking, fluently, pleasantly, and about nothing whatsoever. After 25 minutes she stood, thanked Miss Marple for the coffee, said she really must be getting on, and left by the front path with the slightly accelerated step of someone who has remembered an appointment they had been trying to forget. Miss Marple watched her go. Then she washed the 2 coffee cups with the methodical care of a woman whose best thinking happened at the kitchen sink, and considered what she had learned. Not enough, but enough to know which direction to look. It was Mrs. Hargreave who provided the clue, and she provided it entirely without meaning to, in the course of a conversation about something else entirely. Miss Marple encountered her on Monday morning outside the post office, where Mrs. Hargreave was collecting a parcel with the energetic purposefulness she brought to everything. They exchanged the customary words about the weather and the dreadful business with the poor man in the churchyard. And then Mrs. Hargreave mentioned, as a slight digression, that she was still trying to account for the refreshment table inventory from the fete. "We were 2 cups short at the end," she said with the mild exasperation of a woman for whom inventory discrepancy was a genuine affront. "We counted everything out in the morning. I always count everything out. It's the only reliable system. And at the close, we were short by exactly 2 cups. Paper ones, the good quality, not the cheap sort. And I can't account for it." "People do wander off with cups," said Miss Marple. "Of course they do. and I account for that in the rounding, 6 to 8 cups historically. But we used significantly fewer cups than I'd projected for the attendance. The lemonade wasn't as popular as last year. The raspberry cordial rather overtook it, and yet we finished short. She shook her head. It's the principle of the thing. Quite right, said Miss Marple. 2 cups, specifically. How interesting. Mrs. Hargreave looked at her. Is it? Only that it suggests 2 people took their cups away with them, rather than depositing them at the collection point, which means 2 people left in something of a hurry, or wished not to linger at the table. Or simply forgot, said Mrs. Hargreave practically. Or simply forgot, Miss Marple agreed. Goodbye, Mrs. Hargreave. The parcel looks exciting. The paper cup. She thought about it all the way home, walking slowly in the manner of someone who appears to be thinking about nothing in particular. Leonard Doyle's cup, the one he had carried around the perimeter of the green for 30 minutes without drinking from, had not been found in the churchyard. Inspector Revell had mentioned the contents of Doyle's pockets with precision. Wallet, folded address, £7 and change. No cup, which meant either he had deposited it somewhere between the hedgerow and the churchyard path, or he had given it to someone. And if he had given it to someone, that someone had taken it away. Which meant, Miss Marple thought, pausing at her garden gate, that someone had been close enough to Leonard Doyle to take something from his hand. It in the 3 minutes between his leaving the green and the sound of the shot. That was not how one waited for a man in a churchyard with the intention of shooting him. That was how one met a man who was expected. She went inside and sat for a long time at her writing desk, not writing. The afternoon light moved across the room in its unhurried way. The wood pigeon conducted its inquiries outside. Miss Marple thought about a man holding a cup he never drank from, and the particular quality of someone who carries an object not for its original purpose, but because it gives the hand something to do, while the mind is occupied with something else entirely. She knew that feeling very well. It was, of all people, young Tommy Aldis, 9 years old, the son of the post office and passionate about anything with wheels, who confirmed it, but though he did not know he had confirmed anything at all. Miss Marple met him on Tuesday afternoon near the churchyard wall, where he was engaged in the obscure but absorbing project that small boys always seem to have, underway near stone walls. And she stopped to admire it with the patience that had always served her well with children and suspects alike. "Were you at the fete on Saturday, Tommy?" "Yes. I went on the hook-a-duck 3 times. "Did you win anything?" "A pencil." His expression conveyed what he thought of pencils. "And I saw the man go through the hedge." Miss Marple became very still. "Did you? Which man was that?" "The man with the cup. He went through, and then the other one came from over there." He gestured vaguely toward the lane that ran beside the churchyard's western wall, and they talked for a bit. "How long is a bit?" Tommy considered this with genuine effort. "Long enough for me to go on the hook-a-duck once more. Not quite long enough for twice." "And could you see whether they were friendly? The 2 men talking?" "They weren't shouting," said Tommy, with the pragmatic definition of friendliness available to 9-year-olds. "No, I don't suppose they were." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the churchyard wall. "The second man, the one who came from the lane, did he go back the same way, afterward, after the bang?" Tommy nodded. "Quickly," he said, "not running, but quickly." "And did you see his face?" "Not really." He paused, frowned, uttered with the unsettling accuracy of children reporting things they don't know they've registered. He had nice shoes, though, the shiny kind, like the doctor wears. Miss Marple thanked him and gave him a sixpence and walked home by the long route. She needed to think, and she thought better when her feet were moving and the world was going past at the pace it was meant to be seen. Someone had met Leonard Doyle in that churchyard by arrangement. Someone who knew he was coming, knew when he would come, and left through the western lane quickly but composedly, in the shoes of someone who did not generally walk through churchyard lanes. She wrote 4 names in her notebook when she got home. Then she drew a line through one of them and sat looking at the remaining 3. To Chapter 6, What the Supper Table Revealed. The village supper at Fernown Green was held on the last Tuesday of every month in the assembly room beside St. Cuthbert's, and it was, in the opinion of most who attended it, the social event by which all other social events in the village were quietly measured. It was informal enough to encourage candour, and structured enough to prevent the kind of candour that could not be taken back. People sat where they liked, which meant they sat where habit had placed them, which meant Miss Marple always had an excellent view of everyone, and an immediate neighbour who found her restful rather than stimulating, which suited her precisely. This month the supper had an atmosphere rather like a stage after a significant performance. The event itself concluded, the audience still present, no one quite willing to leave and concede that it was over. Leonard Doyle was not mentioned by name. He was referred to, when referred to at all, as the business at the fete, which gave him the quality of a shared weather event, impersonal, unfortunate, and not any single person's fault. Miss Marple ate her lamb stew and listened to everything. It was the placement of the salt cellar that began it. She was seated 4 places from Colonel Branscom, with Mrs. Dunbar between them, providing the reliable acoustic function of a woman who can hold 2 conversations simultaneously. The Colonel had been talking to the man on his right, old Mr. Finch, who was deaf enough to make conversation optional, when Iris arrived late, 20 minutes after the soup, and took the empty chair beside her father. She had dressed carefully, too carefully, in Miss Marple thought, for a monthly supper in an assembly room that smelled of old hymnals. The cream blouse again, or one very like it, and her hair done with an attention that spoke of something to prove, or someone to prove it to. Dr. Vane was seated across the table and 3 chairs down. He did not look up when Iris sat. The not looking had the quality of a practiced thing. The Colonel passed Iris the salt cellar without being asked. A small automatic gesture, the kind that accumulates only between people who have eaten together for a long time, or people who understand each other very precisely. Iris took it, used it, set it down, and then said something to her father in a voice too low for Miss Marple to catch. The Colonel's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change. His jaw tightened in the manner of a man declining to respond to a provocation in a public setting. Iris said something else. "Not here," said the Colonel, distinctly enough to carry. Mrs. Dunbar, whose antennae for the significant were impeccably calibrated, fell briefly silent. Then, with the discipline of a woman who understood that silence draws more attention than speech, resumed her account of the tombola irregularities of 1987 at sufficient volume to provide conversational cover. Miss Marple found her opportunity in the interval between the main course and the pudding, when the assembly room reorganized itself in the habitual way, some people stepping outside, others gravitating toward the tea urn, the long table briefly abandoned. She positioned herself near the window with a cup of tea, is within natural conversational range of Dr. Vane, who was standing alone examining the parish notice board with the focused attention of a man who was not reading any of it. "Dreadful about the roof fund," said Miss Marple, nodding toward the notice board. Dr. Vane turned. For a fraction of a second, less than a second, something moved behind his eyes before the pleasant professional expression reassembled itself. "I beg your pardon." "The church roof. They're £300 short of the target." She nodded at the relevant notice. "They always are. It's become almost traditional." He smiled, and the smile was good, warm and genuine around the edges, which made it more troubling rather than less. A wholly false smile was a simple thing. A mostly true one with a small hidden seam was considerably more interesting. "You seem tired," Miss Marple observed, with the gentle directness she had found that people over 70 could employ without giving offence. "I do hope the business with poor Mr. Doyle hasn't been keeping you up." "One is always affected by a death in the community," he said carefully, "even of someone one didn't know." "Of course," she looked at her tea. "Fernown Green is a small place to carry a large event. I imagine everyone is feeling it rather." She paused. "I didn't realize, until quite recently, that Mr. Doyle had visited the village before Saturday." A silence, precise and informative. "Had he?" said Dr. Vane. "It appears so. Some weeks earlier, I believe. I don't suppose you saw him then either." "I don't believe I did," he said steadily, and too steadily, the answer arriving without the fractional delay that a genuine search of memory requires. Miss Marple finished her tea. "Well, one does accumulate visitors at this time of year. The countryside is so lovely in June." She set her cup down and offered him the mild smile she reserved for moments of quiet significance. "Do try to sleep, Dr. Vane. These things have a way of resolving themselves, one finds." He watched her go with an expression she did not see but would have recognized, the particular look of someone who has just understood that a conversation has been about something other than what it appeared to be. Colonel Branscom left early before the pudding. Iris did not leave with him. She sat very still at the half-cleared table, turning her dessert spoon over and over in the manner of someone engaged in an argument conducted entirely internally. After a time she set the spoon down and looked across the room at Dr. Vane, who was now talking to Mrs. Hargreave about the roof fund with determined animation. The look lasted long enough to be something, and not long enough to be caught. Except that Miss Marple, from her position near the door, caught it. She caught, too, the moment when Iris Branscom reached into her evening bag and checked something, a note, a card, a folded piece of paper, before closing the bag again with a snap that was slightly too forceful for the size of the clasp. It was Mrs. Poole's who supplied the missing detail, entirely unprompted, as the room was clearing. "Did I tell you," she said, attaching herself to Miss Marple's elbow with the persistence of a woman who has been storing something up, "that I saw that poor Mr. Doyle at the Carston Garden Centre 3 weeks ago Tuesday. I remember because I was looking at the climbing roses, and he walked past twice, which I thought peculiar, and then I saw him talking to someone by the car park." "Did you recognize the person he was talking to?" Mrs. Pooles lowered her voice to the register of someone conferring significant intelligence. "That's the thing. It was Colonel Branscom's girl, Iris." She paused to allow this to settle. "They looked, well, They looked as if they knew one another, properly knew one another. She had his arm just briefly, the way you do with someone you've not seen in some time. Then they went to separate cars. Miss Marple walked home through the blue summer evening, past the churchyard where Leonard Doyle had been found, and the hedgerow where a child had watched two men meet by arrangement and part in a very different manner. She knew now that Iris Branscom had lied. She knew that Dr. Vane knew more than he had said. She knew that Leonard Doyle had come to Fernown Green at least twice, and that the second visit had not been his first contact with someone in this village. What she did not yet know was which of those facts led to the shot. She was, however, beginning to have a very clear idea. Part 7. The Arrest of the Wrong Man. Marcus Sherwood was taken into custody on Wednesday morning at a bed and breakfast in Carston called The Willows, and where he had been staying under the name Peter Crane, and eating a full English breakfast with the appetite of a man who did not consider himself in any immediate danger. He was 49, broad across the shoulders, with the flattened affect of someone who had spent considerable time in rooms where displaying feeling was disadvantageous. He said nothing on arrest, nothing in the car, and nothing in the first 2 hours at Carston Police Station, which Inspector Revell found professionally frustrating, but personally unsurprising. By Thursday afternoon, however, the outline of Sherwood's connection to Leonard Doyle had been established well enough that Revell felt confident briefing Constable Hedges with the word motive and a tone of resolution. Sherwood and Doyle had been associates in Bristol, the nature of the association being the kind that did not produce documentation, but left traces in other people's records. 3 years previously, a sum of money, the figure was imprecise but substantial, had passed between them in circumstances that Sherwood apparently considered unsatisfactory. There had been, according to a source Revell declined to name to Hedges, words. There had been, on one occasion, more than words. Doyle had left Bristol. Sherwood had, until recently, remained. The theory assembled itself with the satisfying ease of a theory built on genuine facts, arranged in the most convenient sequence. Miss Marple heard about the arrest from Constable Hedges himself, who stopped at her gate on Thursday morning with the pleased expression of a man carrying news he knows to be interesting. "They've got their man, then," she said when he had finished. "All but," said Hedges, with the slight qualification of someone who has worked long enough with Inspector Revell to know that all but is meaningfully different from entirely. Sherwood was at the fete. Nearby. Can't place him on the green itself, but the landlord at the Willows confirms he went out late morning and wasn't back until past 4. Plenty of time, Miss Marple agreed. Did anyone see his shoes? Hedges blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Never mind. It's a very small thing." She smiled at him pleasantly. "I'm sure the inspector has everything well in hand." Hedges cycled away with the faintly unsettled expression that Miss Marple occasionally produced in people who could not identify precisely what she had said to cause it. She walked to Dr. Vane's surgery that afternoon, with the stated purpose of discussing a slight stiffness in her left hand that had been troubling her intermittently for several weeks. This was true. It was not, however, her primary purpose. The surgery occupied the ground floor of a converted Georgian house on the Carston Road, and had that quality common to all good general practice waiting rooms of feeling simultaneously clean and slightly tired. There were 3 people ahead of her. She waited with her knitting and listened to the receptionist, a Mrs. Peel of efficient disposition, managing the telephone with the contained authority of someone running a modest empire. Dr. Vane saw her at 3:30. He examined her hand with professional care and said the stiffness was consistent with early joint inflammation, manageable with warmth and the occasional aspirin, nothing to cause concern. He said it all correctly, with the right balance of reassurance and clinical precision. He was, she thought, an extremely competent doctor. She had not doubted that. "I understand they've made an arrest," she said as he made his notes, "so I've heard." The pen moved steadily. "A man called Sherwood, from Bristol." She watched his hand. "I imagine that's a relief. For the village?" "I imagine it is." A pause. "For everyone." "For everyone," Miss Marple agreed. "Though of course Mr. Sherwood will require the matter to be proven, which means Inspector Ravel will be working through the details for some time yet. One thing I understand is still outstanding, is the question of how Mr. Sherwood knew Mr. Doyle would be at the fete on Saturday, and specifically that he would come through the hedgerow gap at that particular hour." She smoothed her glove on her lap. Mr. Sherwood had no known connections in Fernown Green, you see. He would have required some form of local intelligence. The pen had stopped. It remained stopped for 2 seconds, 3, 4, just long enough. "I hadn't considered that," said Dr. Vane. "No," said Miss Marple kindly. "Most people haven't." She paid her consultation fee to Mrs. Peel and stepped back into the afternoon. The letter arrived at Carston Police Station on Thursday evening. Inspector Ravel found it on his desk when he returned from a second interview with Sherwood, still unproductive, and read it twice before sitting down. It was from Leonard Doyle's sister, Miss Patricia Doyle, and it was written with the unsentimental precision of a woman who has decided, after considerable deliberation, that silence has become more costly than speech. Ravel read it a 3rd time. Then he put on his jacket and drove to Fernown Green. Miss Marple opened the door before he knocked, which was a habit of hers that people found disconcerting without being able to explain precisely why. "Inspector, you've had a letter." He stared at her. "How did you—" "You have the look of a man who has recently revised a confident opinion. It's a very particular expression. Do come in." He came in. He sat. He declined tea, which told her the matter was more pressing than courtesy. "Patricia Doyle writes that her brother came to Fernown Green 6 weeks ago," he said. "Not for criminal reasons, for personal ones." He looked at his hands. Doyle was not well. His heart. It appears he had a daughter, a girl of 11. The mother is dead. He had been attempting to make arrangements, in the event of his own death, for the child's welfare. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. She thought of the photograph in a dead man's wallet. The woman, the girl, the grey northern sea. "He came here," she said gently, "because someone in Fernown Green had agreed to take the child, if it came to that." "It appears so." Ravel's voice had lost its resolution. "Which means his visit was not criminal in nature, and which means the connection to Fernown Green is not what I assumed it was." "No," said Miss Marple, "I thought not." "And Sherwood had the motive and the opportunity. But if he didn't know Doyle would be here—" "He couldn't have acted alone," Miss Marple said simply. "Someone invited Leonard Doyle to the fete, and someone told Marcus Sherwood that he would be there." Ravel looked at her with the expression of a man approaching a conclusion he does not find comfortable. "You know who." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Outside, the evening was settling softly over Fernown Green, the rooks making their slow arrangements in the elm trees, the lanes emptying in the gradual way of summer evenings. "I know," she said, "but knowing and demonstrating are two different things, Inspector. And the person concerned is not simple." She paused. "I should like 2 more days." Ravel looked at her for a long moment. 2 days, he said, "not 3. 2 will be sufficient," said Miss Marple. "It always comes down to something small. I simply need to confirm which small thing." He left. She sat for a time in the quiet. Then she rose, went to her writing desk, and drew a line through a second name in her notebook. She looked at the 2 that remained, side by side, and she thought about a pair of shiny shoes on a churchyard lane, and a folded paper in a dead man's pocket, and the particular way a person reaches into an evening bag and closes it again when the news they have been dreading has not yet come. Not 3 names now. She was almost certain. But almost was not enough. Not yet. Add Chapter 8. The Truth Told Sideways. Miss Marple telephoned Carston Hall on Friday morning and asked in the pleasantly vague manner she had cultivated over many decades whether Colonel Branscom might be able to spare her 20 minutes that afternoon. She was sorry to impose. It was simply that she was returning a book she had borrowed from his library some months ago, and felt dreadful about keeping it any longer. There was no such book. She had never borrowed anything from Carston Hall's library in her life. The Colonel, who was of a generation that received guests as a matter of honour rather than inclination, said 3 o'clock would be perfectly convenient. Carston Hall was a house that had been impressive for so long it had stopped noticing. The gravel drive needed attention, and the east wing showed damp along its upper cornice, in a way that had probably been showing for 15 years. The interior, however, retained the comfortable permanence of rooms that have absorbed several generations of the same family's habits. Good furniture arranged without self-consciousness, books on shelves that appeared to have been read rather than displayed, a faint smell of wood smoke even in summer. The Colonel received her in the drawing-room, standing by the window in his habitual posture of braced fortitude, and offered her a chair and a glass of sherry, with the mechanical courtesy of a man performing a social function in the same way he had always performed it, because the alternative was to stop performing it, and he did not intend to do that. Iris was not present. Miss Marple had expected she would not be. "Oh, very good of you to come," said the Colonel, with the slight stiffness of a man who considers himself to have been good, and wishes to be recognized as such without having to say so. "Very good of you to receive me," said Miss Marple. "And I must confess immediately to a small dishonesty. There is no book. I do apologize. I simply wish to speak with you privately, and I find that people are generally more at ease in their own homes." The Colonel looked at her. Whatever he had expected from a white-haired woman from the village carrying a cloth bag, it had not been this. He sat down, which was something. "What is it you wish to speak about?" "Leonard Doyle," said Miss Marple. A silence, the wood smoke smell, a clock on the mantelpiece conducting its patient business. "Oh, I've told the police everything I know about that man," said the Colonel, "which is nothing. I'd never heard of him before Saturday." "No," said Miss Marple, "but Iris had. He was a man of considerable self-discipline. The expression that crossed his face was brief and quickly contained, not quite surprise, not quite guilt, but something adjacent to both. the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just felt someone else's hand upon it. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "I think you do," said Miss Marple gently. "I think Iris told you about Leonard Doyle before the fete. I think she told you more than she has told anyone else, because she needed someone's advice, and you are, in her mind, the correct person to ask when one needs advice about how to manage something difficult and quiet and serious." She paused. "I think you gave her advice. I'm not certain yet whether it was the right advice." The Colonel set down his sherry. "You're asking me whether I knew my daughter was connected to a dead man." "I'm telling you," said Miss Marple, "that Inspector Ravel will be here by Sunday, and that when he comes he will have considerably more information than he had on Wednesday. A letter has been written, Colonel, by a person who has decided that continued silence is the wrong course. That changes the shape of things." She allowed this to settle. "I thought you would wish to know that before Sunday." It was all true. Every sentence was factually accurate, and the implication that the letter implicated someone in this room was entirely her own addition. She watched him. Colonel Branscom was, she had always thought, a man of fundamental decency, caught in circumstances that decency alone could not resolve. He had the look now of someone who has spent 2 weeks holding a structural wall in place with his own hands, and has just been informed that the building is coming down regardless. "She didn't know," he said very quietly. "What would happen, she had no idea." "I believe that," said Miss Marple with complete sincerity. "She came to me 3 days before the fete. She said Doyle had contacted her, that he needed her to, that there was an arrangement she had made in good faith about the child, and that he wanted to discuss the terms at the fete because it was public and safe. He said, and she could bring someone if she wished." His jaw tightened. "She asked me whether she should go. And you said?" "I said I would make inquiries about the man first." A pause, long and weighted. "I made a telephone call to a man who had handled certain financial matters for me in the past. A man with connections of the type one doesn't examine too closely when they're useful." He looked at his hands, which were steady with the steadiness of effort. "I described Doyle, his background, his Bristol connections. The man said he knew of him, and that Doyle had made an enemy of someone dangerous, and that this enemy had been looking for him." "Marcus Sherwood," said Miss Marple. "I didn't know his name. I didn't ask." His voice had dropped to something barely above conversational. "I told Iris to go to the fete as normal. Say nothing. Do nothing. I thought the knowledge would simply reach the interested party, and Doyle would be warned away. I thought the connection would sever itself." He looked up at her. "I did not intend for any harm to come to anyone." "No," said Miss Marple. "I don't believe you did. I passed information," he said with the flat precision of a man convicting himself aloud. "That is all I did. But Doyle is dead." Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. Outside, the June afternoon moved through the elm trees with complete indifference. A long way off, something agricultural was happening in a field. "Where is Iris?" she said. "She went to see Vane." He said it with the tone of a man who has spent 2 weeks disapproving of something and has run out of the energy to continue. "She has been seeing Vane. For some months. Doyle knew about it. I don't know how. He used it, I think, as a reason to contact her directly, rather than through the solicitor who had handled the child arrangement." "He used it," Miss Marple said quietly, "because he was a man who used whatever was available. Not cruelly, I think, but out of habit." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You must speak to Inspector Revell, Colonel. Before Sunday, if possible. It will be considerably better for everyone, including Iris, if the account comes from you." He stood automatically. Old courtesies run deep, and if I don't... Miss Marple picked up her cloth bag. Empty, and always had been. "You are not a man who would choose not to," she said, with a certainty that was entirely genuine. "That is why I came to you rather than the inspector, because I have found, over a rather long life, that some people need to be given the correct moment to do the thing they already know is right." She left him standing by the window with his untouched sherry and the accumulated weight of a decision already made, requiring only the space to be made in. On the drive back to the village, Miss Marple sat in the afternoon light and thought about the remaining name in her notebook, which was not the Colonel's and was not Iris Branscom's. She thought about shiny shoes on a churchyard lane. She thought about a man who had stopped his pen for 4 seconds when a question did not warrant 4 seconds. She thought about the quality of a smile that was mostly true. She had her confirmation now. It had arrived not from the Colonel's words, but from the thing he had not said, and the name he had not offered, and though it would have been entirely natural to offer it. Dr. Philip Vane had known Leonard Doyle was coming to that fete. Had known, moreover, what Doyle carried with him. Not money, not stolen goods, but the fragile and dangerous weight of a secret that involved someone Vane cared about and intended to protect. The question that remained was whether protection, in Philip Vane's calculation, had extended only to the passing of information, or had gone somewhat further than that. Chapter 9. What Miss Marple Knew. Inspector Revell agreed to Saturday morning, which gave Miss Marple Friday evening to think and Saturday morning to be certain, which was the order she preferred. She telephoned him at 7, gave him 3 names and an address, and said only that she would be grateful if he would arrange to have everyone present by 11, and would trust her to conduct the first part of the conversation herself. Revell was silent for a moment. Then he said he supposed he had agreed to 2 days, and 2 days it was, and that he would need everything she had. "You will have it," she said, "in the room. It is easier to explain some things in the presence of the people they concern. The truth lands differently when there is no distance between it and the persons it touches." "You sound very certain," he said. "I am certain," said Miss Marple. "I have been uncertain for most of this week, which is the natural condition of an investigation conducted without access to police records or forensic reports. But the thing about human behavior, Inspector, is that it always confirms itself eventually. People cannot sustain an unnatural posture indefinitely. Something always shifts." And something shifted. Several things. The Colonel told me last night what I needed him to tell me without my having to ask him directly, because I gave him the correct conditions in which to say it. And Dr. Vane, she paused. Dr. Vane stopped his pen for 4 seconds. Another silence. "I'll have them there at 11, said Revell. The room Inspector Revell chose was his own office at Carston Station, which had the advantage of being sufficiently official to discourage evasion, without being sufficiently formal to provoke the particular kind of defensive silence that a police interview room produced. There were enough chairs. Someone had provided a tray of tea that nobody touched. Iris Branscom sat closest to the window, very straight, wearing the cream blouse again. Miss Marple noted, without comment, that it appeared to be the garment she reached for when she needed steadiness. Dr. Vane sat to her left, not quite beside her, the distance carefully managed, an inch too far for intimacy and an inch too close for indifference. He had the expression of a man who has been awake for most of the night assembling arguments and is no longer entirely confident in any of them. Inspector Revell sat behind his desk with a stillness that cost him something. Miss Marple took the chair nearest the door, which was where she always sat, and folded her hands in her lap and began. "I should like to start," she said in the pleasant conversational tone of someone opening a parish meeting, "not with what happened in the churchyard, but with why Leonard Doyle came to Fernown Green at all. Because the why of it shapes everything else, and without it the events of that Saturday look considerably more sinister than they are." She looked at Iris, who met her eyes and held them. "Doyle had a daughter," Miss Marple continued, 11 years old. Her mother died 2 years ago. Doyle was not a good man in the conventional sense. He had made poor choices, kept poor company, and had accumulated consequences of the kind that follow a person regardless of how far they travel. But he appears to have loved the child consistently, which is perhaps the most reliable thing that can be said of him. She paused. He was ill, his heart. He knew he was running out of time in a very practical sense, and he needed to make arrangements. Iris's hands tightened in her lap. She did not look away. "Some years before his illness," Miss Marple said, "Iris Branscom had been acquainted with Doyle, briefly, and in circumstances I won't elaborate on, because they are not material to what followed. What is material is that Iris, who is a person of genuine warmth beneath a great deal of composed exterior, had agreed, informally, privately, that if anything happened to Doyle, she would see that the child was provided for, not adopted formally, simply looked after. It was the kind of promise one makes to someone in difficulty without quite imagining it will ever be required." "And then it was required," said Revell quietly. "And then it was required. Doyle contacted Iris 6 weeks ago. He came to Fernown Green once, met her briefly, and explained that the arrangement might need to become concrete sooner than either of them had anticipated." Miss Marple turned very slightly toward Dr. Vane. "Iris told Philip Vane about this meeting because she trusted him, because they had been close for some months, and she needed someone to understand why a man like Leonard Doyle had appeared in her life and what her obligation to him was." Vane said nothing. His hands were very still on his knees. "Dr. Vane is a person who protects people," Miss Marple continued, with a quality in her voice that was neither condemnation nor absolution. "It is not merely professional instinct. It is the deepest arrangement of his character." He had watched Iris carry this quietly for weeks. He had watched it cost her, and when Doyle contacted her again to arrange the meeting at the fete, something shifted in Philip Vane's calculation. "I didn't," Vane began. "Please," said Miss Marple, not unkindly. "Let me finish and then say what you need to say." He stopped. The room was very quiet. "Doyle was not merely ill," she said. "He was also frightened. He had told Iris, and Iris told Vane, that someone from his Bristol past had found him. That this person had made threats. That the fete was chosen specifically because it was public, visible, safe." She looked at Vane steadily. Philip Vane understood that Leonard Doyle was walking into a situation he did not fully control. And Philip Vane decided to know more about Marcus Sherwood than Doyle had managed to find out himself. He made his own inquiries. A muscle moved in Vane's jaw. He discovered where Sherwood was staying. He confirmed that Sherwood had come to Carston. And then he made a decision that he has been living with since Saturday afternoon. She paused. He did not contact the police. He did not warn Doyle to stay away. He went to the churchyard path before the fete began, and he spoke to Marcus Sherwood directly. The silence in the room had weight and texture now. "You spoke to him," said Ravel. "Not a question." Vane looked at his hands. "Yes," he said. "I told him that Doyle was coming, that if he had business with him, the fete gave him the opportunity he had been looking for." He stopped. You thought, said Miss Marple quietly, that Sherwood would confront Doyle, that there would be a scene, perhaps, that it would frighten Doyle sufficiently to make him leave Fernown Green, leave Iris's life, take his complications elsewhere. You thought you were managing something untidy and making it go away." She looked at him with an expression that was, above all else, sad. "You did not think Sherwood would kill him?" "I did not think he would kill him." The words came out stripped of everything except their plain truth. "I did not know. I did not understand what kind of man Sherwood was. I thought it was money. A dispute about money. I thought Sherwood wanted it settled." He looked up, and the professional composure was entirely gone, and what was beneath it was a man who had spent a week inside a mistake of catastrophic proportion. "Doyle walked through that gap, and I was still there, on the lane, and Sherwood—" He stopped. "It was very fast." "You ran," said Miss Marple. "I walked. Or quickly." He said it with the particular horror of someone for whom that distinction has become enormous. "I walked away, and I said nothing, and a child is without a father, and I—" He stopped again. Iris had turned toward him. She was not crying. She looked at him with an expression that was beyond any single feeling, too complex, too layered, still too much hers to show in a room full of people. "Did you fire the weapon?" said Ravel. "No," said Vane. "I have never owned a weapon in my life." "Did you instruct Sherwood to harm Doyle?" "No. Flat, certain. I told him where Doyle would be. That is what I did. That is all I did, and it was enough." He said the last sentence as though he had said it to himself many times already, and intended to say it many times more. Miss Marple folded her hands more firmly. "The Colonel," she said to Ravel, "made a similar error, by a different route. He passed information without asking enough questions about where it would go. Neither man intended Leonard Doyle's death. Both men created the conditions for it. That is a legal distinction, Inspector, and a human one, and both distinctions matter, though they matter differently." Ravel was writing. His face gave nothing away. "And Sherwood. Sherwood is the man who fired the shot," said Miss Marple. "Whatever else is true, that is the most true thing. Everything else is context, important context, and none of it innocent, but context." She settled back in her chair, and the room breathed again unevenly. "There is a child," she said after a moment, to no one in particular, and to everyone in the room. 11 years old, in the north somewhere, with a grey sea. She has no mother and no father now, and she has the considerable disadvantage of being the daughter of a man who was not respectable." She looked at Iris Branscom with the clear, unhurried regard of someone who has said everything that needs saying and waits only to see what remains. A promise was made to her father. I have always thought that promises made to difficult people are the ones most worth keeping, because they are the ones that cost something. Iris held her gaze. She said nothing, but her chin lifted, almost imperceptibly, in the manner of someone arriving at a decision that has, perhaps, been waiting since long before this morning. Chapter 10. The Village in September. Marcus Sherwood was charged with murder on the following Monday. He said nothing in the dock that he had not said in the station, which was nothing at all. And the nothing had a different quality now, less like strategy and more like a man who has concluded that language is no longer available to him in any useful form. Philip Vane was charged with a lesser offence, the provision of information that had materially enabled the commission of a crime. His solicitor, the careful young man from Bristol, who turned out to represent the Doyle family rather than their adversaries, and who had therefore been sitting at the inquest with rather more information than his expression had suggested, argued the case with quiet competence. The charge carried no custodial sentence. It carried instead the permanent and specific weight of public record, which in Miss Marple's experience was frequently more consequential than a prison term for a person of a certain kind. See, Philip Vane closed his surgery on a Wednesday and did not reopen it. By October, he had taken a position in a hospital in Edinburgh, far enough away to constitute a beginning rather than a retreat, if one chose to see it that way. Miss Marple chose to see it that way, because she had found over many years that the charitable interpretation of departure was almost always the more accurate one. People rarely ran from places. They ran toward the version of themselves they hoped to become somewhere else. Colonel Branscom spoke to Inspector Revell on the Saturday afternoon following Miss Marple's visit to Carston Hall, in a conversation that lasted 2 hours and produced a written statement of 17 pages. He was not charged. The law, as it stood, could find no purchase on what he had done, which was make a telephone call and fail to ask sufficient questions about where the answer would go. He bore this, the not being charged, with the particular dignity of a man who considers legal absolution insufficient and has arranged his own alternative. He resigned his chairmanship of the parish council, the Carston Agricultural Committee, and the board of St. Cuthbert's Restoration Fund. He did not explain himself to anyone, which was explanation enough for those who knew him. He remained at Carston Hall. He had nowhere else to go, and Miss Marple suspected, watching him occasionally at the Sunday service from across the aisle, that he was engaged in a long and private act of penance that would outlast the law's interest in him by many decades. There were worse fates. There were worse men. The child's name was Clara. She arrived at Fernown Green on a Thursday afternoon in late September, on the 3:15 from Leeds, carrying a blue canvas bag and the specific self-containment of a child who has learned early that composure is a more reliable asset than need. She was 11 years and 4 months old. She had her father's lean quality and her mother's eyes. And she stood on the platform at Carston with the slightly braced expression of someone prepared for disappointment and determined not to show it. Iris Branscom was on the platform. Miss Marple had not been invited and did not go. She heard about it from Mrs. Hargreave, who had heard it from the station porter, who had been there and found it affecting enough to mention. The Colonel had driven them both back to Carston Hall in silence, the child in the back seat looking out at the September fields, with the careful attention of someone memorizing a new country. Mrs. Hargreave reported that by the following week the child had been enrolled at the Carston Primary School, and that a bedroom on the first floor of the hall had been redecorated in colours that Colonel Branscom had apparently selected himself, with an earnestness that Mrs. Hargreave found tremendously moving. Miss Marple found it tremendously moving too, though she expressed this only in the privacy of her own kitchen to no one. It was October before she and Iris spoke properly. Iris came to the cottage on a Tuesday evening without telephoning first, which was itself a kind of statement. The abandonment of the polite distance that telephoning in advance provides. She sat in the kitchen where she had sat with her careful coffee in the summer, and looked rather more settled in her own skin than she had then, which Miss Marple thought was not nothing. "She's adjusting," Iris said. "Clara. She asks about her father. I tell her what I can. What can you? That he was trying to do right by her. At the end." Iris looked at the table. "That's true, at least, whatever else was true about him." "It is true," said Miss Marple, "and it's the truth that will matter most to her eventually, not the rest of it." "Philip," Iris began and stopped. "You needn't," said Miss Marple. "I think I do, actually." Iris looked up. "He thought he was protecting me. I know that. I knew it when you said it in that room, and it was—" She paused, assembling something careful. "It was the wrong kind of protection, and the kind that doesn't ask the person being protected what they actually need." She was quiet for a moment. "I could have managed Doyle myself. I had been managing him perfectly adequately for 6 weeks. I didn't need—" She stopped again. "No," said Miss Marple. "You didn't. He didn't know that. He didn't ask," said Miss Marple gently, which was a different thing. Iris considered this. "No, he didn't ask." She looked at the window, where the October dark had settled comfortably against the glass. "I've been thinking that's the centre of it, rather than anything else. Everyone, Philip, my father, Doyle, in his own way, everyone was managing information, deciding what the other person needed to know, acting on the decision without checking it." She almost smiled. "No one simply asked. People rarely do," said Miss Marple. "It is the commonest failure, I know, and I have known a great many failures." Iris left at 9, pausing at the gate in the dark. "How did you know?" she said. "When did you know?" Miss Marple considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I suspected from the fete," she said. "I knew from the pen. The pen." Philip stopped writing for 4 seconds, when I mentioned that Doyle had visited before Saturday. A genuine search of memory takes 1 second, perhaps 2. 4 seconds is someone selecting between truths. She looked kindly at Iris across the garden. "He is not a dishonest man. That was rather the difficulty. Dishonest men are faster." Iris nodded slowly. Then she walked up the lane and the dark closed around her, and Miss Marple went inside. The garden in October was a different proposition from the garden in June, and Miss Marple had always found October's version more honest. The roses had finished their performance. The dahlias were making their last considered statement. The elm tree at the end of the lane was releasing its leaves with the unhurried acceptance of something that knows it will come back. She sat in the garden on the following Saturday, still warm enough, if one had a cardigan and the patience for it, with her knitting and the blue afternoon and the wood pigeon conducting its eternal inquiry from somewhere in the middle distance. She thought, as she often did after these things, not about the crime, but about the people around it. Leonard Doyle, who had carried a paper cup around a summer fete without drinking from it, and died trying to do the one decent thing his life had room for. Philip Vane, at whose deepest instinct was to protect, and who had learned, at great cost, that the instinct requires the instruction of the protected to function properly. Colonel Branscom, a decent man in the grip of a habit of authority, that had outlasted its usefulness, doing the wrong thing with the equipment of the right one, and Iris, who had made a promise to a difficult man and kept it at enormous personal cost, and who was, at this moment, Miss Marple thought with the quiet satisfaction of an accurate prediction, sitting with a child named Clara in a redecorated bedroom at Carston Hall, establishing the slow and unremarkable and entirely necessary habits of a shared life. It was not a tidy resolution. It would not become tidy. The law had done what law could do, and the rest had been left to the more ambiguous processes of human beings deciding, in the aftermath of catastrophe, what kind of people they intended to be. In Miss Marple's experience, that was where the real work always happened, and it was slower and less certain than any court proceeding, and it mattered considerably more. The wood pigeon asked its question again. Miss Marple counted her stitches, all present, all correct, and allowed herself, for a moment, the moderate and private satisfaction of a thing resolved. Then she turned to the next row, and the afternoon light moved across the garden in its unhurried way, and Fernown Green went on, as villages do, carrying its new knowledge quietly alongside everything it had always known.